Hello everyone, my name is Nicole Gray and this is part 2 of Cultural Relevancy in Music Education. So let's quickly review some of the literature that I talked about in my first presentation. So Doyle examined different predictors of culturally relevant attitudes and expectations in urban music teachers in the US. So using these different independent variables, she was trying to see what their impact was on culturally relevant attitudes about teaching and music, implicitly prejudiced attitudes, as well as expectations. So here were the findings. Out of 584 music teachers, music educators from 20 large US cities, we saw that the demographics between who was teaching and who was being taught were very different. So that the teachers tended to be the majority that completed this survey were Caucasian female from suburban or rural locations and middle class or higher socioeconomic backgrounds. Meanwhile, the schools were majority Title I, and the majority of the students, the student populations were Hispanic as well as Black or African American. Support ended up being the strongest predictor for expectations and implicitly prejudiced attitudes in teachers towards students. So if administration support was high, the expectations of the teachers for the students would be high, as well as their implicitly prejudiced attitudes would be low. Participant scores were positive between staying culturally relevant in teaching and music, but then at the same time there were negative implicitly prejudiced attitudes about music students in urban school environments. So Doyle discussed how socially acceptable answering might have been at play, where you are asked a specific direct question about race and inclusion, and that a teacher may respond in a positive, inclusive way, but then through their actions they may show something different. And then there was a question about if teachers that are further away from their formal teaching, or their formal training, so that would be undergrad, graduate training, that maybe they did not have the experience of culturally relevant teaching. Here's article number 2, also by Doyle, but it's a different article. This was Cultural Relevance in Urban Music Education, a Synthesis of Literature. So this was a synthesis of music education literature from 2001 to 2012. There are 3 main outline categories that Doyle wanted to focus on. The first was to create a general outline to be able to look at several different categories based off of. So wanting to create a framework to be able to discuss equity for musical opportunities available for all students. The second was a discussion of demographics. And then to examine culturally relevant and multicultural pedagogy in order to create meaningful learning experiences and hopefully to increase enrollment in school music programs. So here are the findings. Socioeconomic factors had a huge impact on student participation in secondary school music. We also saw that students who participate in large ensembles tended to be high academically achieving white and native English speakers. So we're seeing that as soon as students are hitting the secondary school level, socioeconomic factors have an impact on if they can or if they want to continue on. And we see that with who's participating in large ensembles, academically achieving white and native English speakers. Minorities are very much underrepresented in these ensembles. K-12 public schools need to offer non-traditional music offerings. So that would be band, orchestra, and choir is a great place to start, but that's not meeting the needs of all the students in the building. And then music educators tend to agree with teaching multicultural music. There was a study that Doyle cited that 99% of the teachers in that study agreed that including and teaching multicultural music is very important, but then only 21% of them actually performed that music at concerts. So Doyle hypothesized that Eurocentric approaches to music curriculum, which a Eurocentric approach is often taught in pre-service teaching schools, and that is pervasive into the classroom, so that what teachers are taught, what they're most comfortable with, tends to be what they stick with, but that's not applying to all students. So we're going to talk about the new research articles in just a second here, but here are some questions that I want you to think about before we get into them. What are your views about the process versus the product in music education? The process is all the steps that we go through before the concert. So the teaching strategies, the discussions, deliberation between students, things like that. So everything leading up until the concert. And then the product would be the concert, the final performance, the festival rating, things like that. So I'd like you to think about, is one more important than the other? Is process or product better, more important, or are they equal? So think about how that relates to your music program, as well as what you think it should relate to in music education in general. Process or product or process. Here's the first article. This was by Bond, Culturally Responsive Education in Music Education, a Literature Review. The research goals. So the purpose of this review was to describe how and for what purpose culturally responsive education has been addressed in music education so far. So I think it's important for me to define what culturally responsive education means. So Bond defined this as a pedagogy used to validate student experiences and to teach to and through their strengths. So it's very student-led. What the students bring into the classroom is what we should be basing all of the learning off of. That's the baseline, and then we build off of that. This pedagogy also emphasizes high expectations, the formation of cultural competence, and development of a critical consciousness. So critically responsive education has high expectations that students should be learning deeply about different cultures and be able to critically think about them, contrast, compare, and have very deep opinions and be able to describe their feelings and opinions based on what they've learned in class. So it shouldn't just be surface level facts, they should be able to dive deeper and compare and contrast. So here are the methods and the subjects. This was a literature review, so the method was reviewing literature and the subjects were the studies. Here are the categories that Bond looked at: identity and achievement, equity and excellence, developmental appropriateness, teaching the whole student, so not just thinking about what's happening right now in the classroom, thinking about how what they learn in the classroom could be used outside of the classroom in their future. And then finally, student-teacher relationships. The results of this study. So the results showed that Eurocentric traditional approaches to music education is actually discouraging students from participating, enrolling, and continuing on with school music. There is a lack of a connection between the music and the offerings offered in school and what the students feel comfortable with and what they relate to. So they do not see a cultural connection between themselves and the music offered in schools. This is a very big point. The process in which multicultural music and discussions take place is more important than the product. So the discussions, the deliberations, the opinions were shown to be way more important and meaningful to students and the teachers than the product, the final concert. And then Bond presented this problematic situation with teaching multicultural music. So when music educators are using the same Eurocentric pedagogy strategies, for example, that the conductor steps on the podium, they possess the knowledge and they are putting the knowledge into the students' brains. That's not how you're supposed to teach multicultural music. You can still get the same result of students not connecting to the music if it's through that lens. So instead, that these approaches should be embracing discussions, personal interpretations, student-led ideas should be at the forefront of teaching in a culturally responsive lens. Here is Yep, I said everything there. Here is the next article. It's titled, "You Got to Know Us, a Hopeful Model for Music Education in Schools." What was interesting about this article is that the music educators and the authors were the same. So the authors were the ones writing about their experiences in the field. So these music educators combined had 30 years of urban school experience, and they wanted to look at their experiences through the lens of critical pedagogy. We'll discuss that in a second, to disrupt this stereotypical idea that urban schools have lazy teachers, lazy students, that basically that students and teachers in urban schools aren't trying and that they can't succeed. So these teachers that have 30 years of combined experience wanted to push back on that idea and to show kind of a specific but a real lens of what they went through. So I think it's important to define critical pedagogy. This is similar to critically responsive teaching, but this is a two-way street where teachers and students are teaching and learning. So it's not just all on the teacher, the students have something very valuable to bring to the table. Here are the methods and the subjects. So this was a phenomenon research. The researchers were discussing their own experiences, so there's a massive amount of subjectivity in this. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And for something to remember, well, something to know, that the school experiences from these teachers, they discussed experiences ranging from juvenile detention centers all the way to public middle school and high schools. So results, again, because the researchers were writing about their own experiences, think about this as there is a layer of subjectivity that they can't take away themselves from the situation, but I think that also provides a very unique way to view this information. So the results, researchers showed that relationships were prerequisites for meaningful learning. The students had to know that the teachers cared and wanted them to succeed. The students discussed high turnover rates, that teachers were coming in and out of the building, that students didn't have a chance to connect with teachers on a meaningful level, as well as that the music room should be seen as a welcoming environment, a home away from home. This research study also emphasized the process over the product. So the process in which this music was learned, opinions, ideas shared, collaborative nature was way more important than the product that came out. And then this study called on pre-service teachers and current teachers to be flexible in their teaching strategies, to apply their training to best fit the needs and desires of the students in the room. So what you learned in pre-service school is great, that's a great start, but ultimately you have to adapt it to your students to make sure that they are getting the best education possible. And also with this being flexible, that the rules in the classroom structure should adapt to the lesson plan. So knowing when to let go of control and to give more independence to the students so that the students feel like they have an important role in their education. Here are my final thoughts about these articles. So there are a lot of different terms about teaching in ways that are culturally relevant education, culturally relevant teaching. There are lots of different acronyms, but basically what's important to keep in mind is that the practices of these different pedagogies are what's important. So that it's student-led, you're meeting the students where they are starting and you're building them up from there, keeping their cultures in mind and wanting to genuinely learn and incorporate their cultures into the classroom. All teaching should be viewed through this lens of culturally relevant education. So it's not just a project here or there, it's everything you are planning is through a multicultural relevant lens. Students have their own lives, successes, and struggles outside of the school building. That could be between behavior, if they show up for a concert, just being aware of that students have their own lives outside of the classroom. And that teachers must adapt, be flexible, and mold their teaching to the students. All right, here are my references. Thank you for watching. I can't wait to read your comments.